It's my pleasure to introduce Ayan Lustig tonight to speak to us about Israel and the Middle Eastern mud. That's a term in Israeli politics that perhaps would have escaped some of us here. He's Ayan Lustig, incidentally, not Ian Lustig. It's very important for him to make that when we talk to him. Ayan is the Bess Heyman Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. His work is on comparative politics, international politics, Middle Eastern politics, and agent-based computer-assisted modeling for the social sciences. I understand that this has developed into some programs and later on some games based on this program and so on. He teaches courses on Middle Eastern politics, political identities and institutions, techniques of hegemonic analysis, the expansion and contraction of states and the relationships among complexity, evolution, and politics. He's the recipient of many awards, Carnegie Corporation, the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment of Humanities, the Social Sciences Research Council, United States Institute of Peace. Before joining University of Pennsylvania, he spent 15 years at Dartmouth College. He worked for 1 year with the State Department. He's the author of many books. One of them I remember that influenced my thinking on my work on the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian citizens. It's based on his actually on his dissertation, was published in 1980 and became a classical, translated into Hebrew and Arabic, and in English it was called Arabs in the Jewish State. His other books, many other books. Some of us would be interested in the book that's called Trapped in the War in Terror, in which he makes very interesting argument. Actually, I was trying to get Anne to speak to us for 2 years now, and one time we scheduled a meeting, scheduled a seminar in which he was supposed to speak about this, and then for family emergency he couldn't make it. He has a book on state building, failure in British Ireland and French Algeria, For the Land and the Lord, about Jewish fundamentalism in Israel, Unsettled States, that's the one on Ireland, Algeria, and Israel and the West Bank, and many other books. One of them was published in 2005 called Exile and Return, and I was fortunate to have to be part of that project, in which I have a chapter. And that Ayan tells me that book has been published, has been released in paperback this summer. So we're happy to have Ayan here, and he will talk to us about Israel and the Middle Eastern mud.
Well, thank you very much, Nadim. It really is a pleasure to be here. I'm so happy that I could make it.
Using the mic.
Which one? This one.
This
Okay.
that's the mic, and this is
Okay.
we're recording with this.
I very much regret. I think actually I got extremely ill right prior to my coming here, and I just couldn't make it, literally.
Can you hear?
Anytime you hear? Anytime you would like to hear about Trapped in the War on Terror, I guarantee you I'll find a way to come down and talk to you about it. It may get some attention in April. There's a policy paper being released about it by the Independent Institute, and it's a pretty strong critique of the entire idea of the War on Terror, and it may play, I hope it'll play out well in the election cycle. But today I'm returning to a topic that was the core of my work for decades, and that is the Arab-Israeli relationship, specifically the Israeli-Palestinian relationship, both in its own terms and also in theoretical context and also in comparative context. I felt that the three books that I wrote three books that were designed to solve one problem for me, which was how to understand the fact that I was convinced by two absolutely opposing arguments. And here I am, an expert on Israel and the Palestinians, and I couldn't tell whether it was true. that Israel couldn't possibly leave the territories, and they had to be an idiot to think Israel would ever leave, versus Israel couldn't possibly stay in the territories. You had to be an idiot to think that they could stay there. So I wrote the book on Ireland and Algeria, their histories. I wrote the book on settlers in Israel, For the Land and the Lord, and this 600 and something page book, Unsettled States, Disputed Lands.
Excuse me, we
not on.
switch. Yeah. This one?
Forgive me if I don't repeat all that. Which, from my point of view, answered the question. I'm not going to tell you what the answer is, but I was satisfied. I understood which arguments were right in which ways, and I more or less said what was going to happen for the next couple decades, and I think that I was right. And that made me look at other problems. But now I really think that the situation has changed enough so that the analysis that I developed over the 70s and the 80s and published in the early 90s is no longer as valid for thinking creatively about the future. It's good for understanding the past. So I've been developing another approach, which I'm going to share with you today. There's a paper that's out there on the web if you want to read the whole paper, but this goes a little beyond that paper. The original was presented at the Israel Studies Association meeting in Ra'anana, the Open University, in the spring, and I have never received in any unpublished thing I've written as much comment and response as quickly as I received to that, and I think you'll see why, maybe. Okay, so I start out with something that I talked about in the past and that others have talked about, the iron wall. How many of you have heard that phrase? Okay, so I will explain that it refers to something that Zev Jabotinsky, the founder of right-wing maximalist revisionist Zionism, came up with in the mid-1920s. And although Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky officially disagreed on everything, they actually agreed very deeply on the relationship to the Arabs. And the Iron Wall argument that Jabotinsky made in the 1920s, which was published in a couple articles he wrote in Russian, became the basis for 90% of Zionist attitudes toward the Arab problem from the 1920s until the mid-90s, or the late 90s, and that's the key thing. Now so in order for you to understand why I think a tremendous change has taken place, in the late 90s, early aughts, I need to explain what this policy was. Now, I also want to warn you that I'm going to make an analysis today of a Middle East situation that looks at Israel. It looks like I'm going to write a book about this, and I'm going to need to look equally at the Arab world, because I believe a similar abandonment of a similar policy toward Israel is underway, equally foreboding. But today you're going to only hear one side of the argument. So the theory of the Iron Wall was this. Jabotinsky said, if we were the Palestinian Arabs, and by the way, he used the words Arabs of Palestine, when the Likud and the right wing in Israel translates the article and publishes it so that they can say they're following Jabotinsky's argument, they changed the words to the Arabs of the land of Israel. But in the original Russian, it's the Arabs of Palestine. And he said, the Arabs of Palestine are no fools. They're like any other real national group. And they will not give up their land to alien settlers like us. In other words, he called the Jews the alien settlers. He said, even Papuans wouldn't. Why should we expect them to? And we can't buy them either with sweet false promises or bribes as my vegetarian friend. And we can't negotiate with them now as my vegetarian opponents in the Zionist movement say we should. Because they aren't dumb. They know that what we want is exactly bad for them. We want this country to be Jewish, and they don't. If we were them, we would take the same position. On the other hand, we need, in the long run, peace with the Arabs. So what do we do? It is not true that Zionism ignored the Arab problem. It's true that they pretended to ignore it for quite a while. But Jabotinsky was the first one who publicly, directly confronted the analytically difficult question, what do we do? And he said, this is what we do. We create an iron wall, which he wanted to actually be British bayonets, really Irish bayonets, because it's the Irish the British had in the army over there. And this iron wall would be so strong that the Arabs would throw themselves against it repeatedly, trying to destroy the Jewish presence, but they would fail. The glass that the labor Zionists took on this was that we'll build the iron wall out of Jewish soldiers, not rely on the British. But the principle was the same. You build an iron wall that's undefeatable. And then every time there's an opportunity for a conflict with the Arabs, and you inflict 10 times the pain and suffering on them that they inflict on you. The result over time will be the following. This is what Jabotinsky predicted. That eventually, because the Arabs are a normal people, remember that normal is a magic word in Zionism. That's the whole idea that Jews also must be a normal people. The Arabs are a normal people, and any normal people, when faced with repeated defeat and the thwarting of their ambitions, what will happen? Eventually a split will develop between the moderates and the extremists among the Arabs of Palestine and the Arabs in general. The extremists will say, no, never. Never surrender what we know is right. But the moderates will say, better we take half a loaf than nothing. And they will come to accept our presence not as of right, but as of reality, that we will have established ourselves as ineradicable. Once that happens, and we see the split between the moderates and the extremists, then we isolate the extremists by negotiating fairly with the moderates. This is Jabotinsky talking. He even used the phrase, on the principles of equal national rights and a promise by us not to drive them out. Now, this was, if you break this down, and every argument that's made in politics you can infer a theory of politics from the argument, which is one of the main ways I get my hypotheses, and why it's fun to listen to very extreme, very wacky people, because they've got interesting theories. But his theory was not wacky at all. He said, so the theory is, first we build the iron wall, and then the next stage is, the next thing that happens is we defeat the Arabs over and over again. The next thing that happens is they split into moderates extremists. The next thing that happens is we recognize that they've split. The next thing that happens is that we negotiate with the moderates to isolate the extremists. The next thing that happens is we get to an agreement. And we live happily ever after, more or less.
And what year was that? Just before?
1925.
1925.
Okay. If you know enough about the history of the conflict, then you'll realize, and if you want a detailed analysis of this, I published this in an article in Israel Studies in summer of 1996. This is the locus classicus for this argument. Avi Shlaim, by the way, if I may say so, took the argument.
The iron wall.
Yes, it's cited, but the whole book, okay. So, that was successful. The iron wall did defeat the Arabs repeatedly. Also, it was true that the Arabs split into moderates and extremists. You could even see that in the 50s, but you certainly could see it after 67. Acceptance front, rejection front. I mean, I don't have to go through the West, the insiders, the outsiders, even inside the PLO. Then, there were those in Israel, small number, that saw it, but for the most part, what Israel did is it did not say, oh, look, there's moderates, now we got to negotiate with them. Instead, what they said is, they're tricking us. It's the strategy of stages. The extremists are the ones that are still in charge. And instead of isolating the extremists, they isolated the moderates. So Sartawi and all of those like him were eliminated. And the Gulf it became harder and harder to move forward. How? What happened after that, very quickly, is that the Arabs eventually started building their own iron wall. The first sign of it was the War of Attrition, the 73 War, the Lebanon War, first Lebanon War, the Intifada. And if you look at Israeli governments, you can see the effect of the Arab iron wall. If you think about the political effect on the government that fought a war starting in 48 on, you see that it was a positive political effect for the government up until the War of Attrition. Every war since the War of Attrition has been more catastrophic politically for the government in charge at the time than the previous war, in one way or another. And that started to create this effect inside of Israel, where people started to say, maybe we shouldn't go for everything that's ours. They started to react like a normal people. But essentially you've had this oscillation of each side teaching the other, but not being able to teach it enough, and also with the United States basically preventing the process from coming to consummation. Before I get into my own argument about, and to just seal this issue of the Iron Wall, to explain it, I want to point out that Jabotinsky made a grave error. Because what he said, he was correct, that a normal people, when confronted with constant frustration and pain and an option to settle for less than they think they deserve, will do so. But what he didn't think was, what does a normal people do that constantly wins and is over and over again victorious over an enemy that it naturally comes to see as weak and undeserving and terrifying? Well, what that normal people does is it expands its sense of what it should have. And that's exactly what happened inside of Israel. So if Jabotinsky had been a real social scientist and had worked from the logic of his argument, he would have seen that he could not assume that the demands of the Jewish side inside the Iron Wall would remain stable, because they expanded. They've only in the last 15 years, since the first Intifada, started to retract. So that's more than 15 years now. Okay, that's my Iron Wall argument. Now I'm going to tell you that's no longer what's going on. The new stage began in the late 90s, and especially with the end of Camp David and the Al-Aqsa Intifada. But I think you can capture it by an image that was associated with the Lebanon War that Nadim mentioned. So when Israelis went into Lebanon, the idea, insofar as there was an idea, was we're going to put the Palestinian problem on the back burner for 40 years. We're going to set up a friendly state in Lebanon under friendly Christians. And we are going to seal the fate of the West Bank by neutralizing the ability of the Palestinians and the PLO to raise problems there. That's why the war in Lebanon.
82.
The 82 war. The first Lebanon war is a war. Israel went in there. It accomplished a great deal at the beginning. It did not go all the way inside of Beirut because of a mutiny in the army. But things fell apart very quickly. Bashir Gemayel was killed. It became an utter mess, and a civil war broke out in the Shuf Mountains. Israeli soldiers were being shot at by both sides. Israel was there for 18 years altogether. And the Israeli image of Lebanon was captured in the phrase Habotz HaLebanoni, the Lebanese mud or muck. Now what does that mean? The image is not too unfamiliar to Americans, that the more you thrash around in it, the more you sink deeper into frustration and impotence. This is a place that does not respond to our rationality. It doesn't respond to our attempt to shape it. It's hopeless. That's what Habotz HaLebanoni means. And while Sharon was alive, who lost his job and almost lost his freedom, based on and he was also, by the way, legally banned from being defense minister for life. He could be prime minister, which he became, but he could not be defense minister again. He realized, and he never forgot, don't go into Lebanon. It was when he died that the military that did not fight the first Lebanon war, and was mainly dominated by the Air Force and was itching to go back in, they were able to do it. But the image of Habotz HaLebanoni kept Israel out of trouble, as the Vietnam syndrome kept the United States out of wars in Angola and Nicaragua and elsewhere we would have been in otherwise. So I want you to have that image in mind, because my argument is that, very simply, that instead of Israel seeing Lebanon as Habots, they're increasingly seeing the entire Middle East as Habots HaMizrach HaTichoni. This is my phrase. You don't find it in the Israeli press, but it captures the way Israelis think. And I believe you will find it in the Israeli popular culture. Habots HaMizrach HaTichoni. The whole Middle Eastern mud, or muck. I want to take that image that I shared with you and break it down logically. If you believe that you're stuck or in this kind of muck, what should you see? What does that imply about your policies and your outlooks? And then we'll see if we see those in Israel. So it implies logically three things. First of all, you have no idea what's going to happen in the future because you don't have any control over it. So confusion about the future, actually not much thinking about the future. If you believe that you're operating in an area that has no rational, is not responsive in any rational way, then you don't use force rationally. Mm-hmm. Use it in some other way. And if you can't do anything in an environment and it's intolerable to be there, it can only get worse, you try to escape. You leave. And the title of the paper, which this talk is based on, is called Leaving the Middle East. All right, so let's look at those three things. First, confusion. One of the things that I noticed in my unsystematic but constant discussions with Israelis over the last 7 or 8 years, maybe more, is a gradual, is that I'd start noticing that people on the right couldn't answer a question that I constantly and irritatingly ask every Israeli that I meet. Tell me a future for the country that you think is both possible and that you like it. I don't want to hear one that you think is possible but you don't like it, or that you like but you don't think is possible. Tell me one that you like and you think it's possible. And on the right, I was seeing that they weren't able to answer this question anymore. When I wrote my book on Gush Emunim, it was easy for them to write. They had full faith that there's going to be a Jewish state in the whole land of Israel, and the Arabs are going to leave or be totally irrelevant. We're going to have massive aliyah from the United States and the Soviet Union, and things are going to be terrific, just the way God promised. Now, and they even, some of them would say, well, we're going to get rid of the Arabs. Nobody on the right, very few people that started to be able to say that at all. They could still say what they would like, but not that it's possible. And anything they thought was possible, they didn't like. They even found it unacceptable, which led to a policy of simply trying to stop everything. I used to use, in fact, I published this image that if the left was constantly trying to roll the dice in after every American presidential campaign, every opportunity, have another peace conference, another peace process, or roll the dice. Maybe one day it'll come up, snake eyes,
Sevens, right.
or whatever. And Gush Emunim's strategy became simply, don't let them throw the dice. It's not that we have an alternative, just don't let them throw the dice. Why? Because they ultimately thought that the only way they could win is if the two dice came up 13. And since they knew that wasn't possible, then the only way to fight it is to not allow the process to ever get started. Okay, well, what I've seen in the last period of time is that inability to answer the question has moved across the spectrum. So that it used to be that moderate Israelis, in other words, would say, I know it's going to be tough, but I still think there can be a two-state solution, and Arafat, and this, or well, now you got to go all the way over on the extreme left to find somebody who thinks that this is possible and they like it. And even they are starting to think that maybe that's not possible, really. Maybe we have to start thinking of some one-state solution, which is even less possible, but at least they like it more. They're really befuddled. Well, this befuddlement and confusion is what we started off saying is implied by this boats. I gather, as is my wont, pretty annoying little quotes from people who would otherwise not like to be quoted, and observations. You may know about the Jewish People's Population. It's a JPPPI. Dennis Ross is the honorary president of it, Chaim Waxman, and also another honorary, real president is, what's his name, this futurologist, Yecheskel Dror, who writes The Future of the World and The Future of Israel. So I follow this outfit's publications. They just produced projections for the Jewish, the Jewish people in 2007, including detailed, I'll talk about it in a minute, but immigration into Israel. And it's very instructive to see what they say and what they don't say.
2007 is not future anymore.
Right, well, they try, but it's always based on looking forward, except in a couple of respects, which I'll get to. But right now, I just want to point out that Yecheskel Dror had a big project. We're going to write a book. People willing to write on this topic. I was amazed that they made that public. Okay.
Why is that?
Why is that? I'm saying that this is part of a pervasive reality that Israelis can no longer think about the future in any positive way or any realistic, well, not quite. I'm about to tell you a very positive way they can think about it, but it has to be a fantasy. It can't be real. In fact, Yecheskel Dror published The Future of Israel in the Next 25 Years. He published two scenarios, the nightmare scenario and the nice scenario. There's two, this is the Jew, if you follow his advice, you can avoid the nightmare scenario. Otherwise, you get the nightmare scenario. And the nightmare scenario is basically Israel shriveled up and goes away because of an abandonment of Zionist values and fall in immigration and continued challenges to the Jewish state principle by Arabs in the country, and et cetera, et cetera. The positive future delineates as Israel, which is rehabilitated by an infusion of Zionist spirit. Nowhere in this long document, nor the Middle East. The West is mentioned, but it says this Israel, this future, it's positive, but it has nothing to do with the Middle East. To make an even finer point on it, Nikuda, which I'm a faithful reader of, which is the magazine of the Jewish settlements in Judea, Samaria, no longer in the Gaza district, in Judea and Samaria, and the Jordan Valley and the Golan. They published an article. First of all, they published a whole symposium. Has the historical mission of Zionism exhausted itself? The answer, yes. Yes. But more interesting than that is an article by a not very well-known guy named, his last name is Sorek, who said, the left is always saying that the right doesn't have an answer to what we want, only that we know what we don't want. It's about time we answer them. And so he wrote an article saying, we want this kind of a Jewish state, we want this, and we want this. Now, with respect to the Arabs, they're always saying that we don't know what we want to do about the Arabs. Well, I'm going to tell you. And that is, we should subsidize Arab agriculture in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. Why, you might say, why should we subsidize Arab agriculture? Because in 20 years it will be a terrific tourist attraction as Christian pilgrims want to see what the Holy Land was like in the time of Jesus. So in other words, insofar as they think they're being realistic, and we're going to face up to the Arab question, it's as a theme park. It's Disneyland. It has nothing to do with reality.
Oh my goodness.
Okay, now that's just an example of the data that I could bring for you. So that's now on another, and just one more example of this inability to think in any way but darkly, and usually that means they don't think about it, about the future, is Arnon Sofer, famous geographer from Haifa. I'm sure many of you know him well. He and his assistant have written a book that was actually discussed on you can find it on the web. There's amazing conversations on the web with the chancellor or the rector of Haifa University about this book. And it's called The Threat of the Tel Aviv State to the Future of Israel. And the idea is that the Israeli population is concentrating itself in this overly westernized, hyper-crowded metropolis called Tel Aviv and abandoning the rest of the country to the Arabs. And it's shrinking, and it's never going to be able to be sustained because it won't have a standard of life that can keep the elite. And it's It's actually, I think, there's a lot of power in this argument. But there's an example. You can't find very many people working with facts and with Arabs who are looking forward into the future and have anything positive from but he's known as a firebrand, doomsday, Chicken Little, the sky is falling. For him, the sky's been falling for a long time, different ways, but it usually has to do with the Arab-Jewish population balance. All right, so I hope I have proven to you that the logical implication of Habot's image of confusion about the future is the case, but I've had to do it very briefly. Second, the non-rational use of force. Note that the Iron Wall strategy is actually based on something which I know my Arab friends don't like to hear the phrase. I don't know, I object to their objection, but it's a pedagogy of force. The idea is to use force pedagogically. But Jabotinsky says, we must negotiate with the Arabs, but not now. That's the mistake the vegetarians make. We can only negotiate with them when they have accepted our their inability to eradicate us. He said it would be we can't negotiate them when they want to negotiate. We have to, like now, they have to be forced into it. But they have to be brought intellectually through almost a stimulus response kind of education. It's if you believe, as he did, that they have a legitimate, natural belief that they have a right to the whole land, that's the only way you could proceed. It was a very rationalist analysis. So I'm trying to point out that for Zionism, the use of force was very rational. Now, I use that word rational in a technical sense. I'm not using it to mean good. I'm using it to mean designed to efficiently achieve a purpose. That's what rationality means in a logical way. And that's the meaning I'm using. What I'm saying is that is no longer the case. That in order to use force rationally, you must have a longer-term objective so that the force is going to have a political payoff in the context of an overall strategy. And I gave you the original Zionist strategy, which did have a justification for a certain kind of force. So you could actually shoot and cry. You could kill Arabs and say, it's a pity I have to do this, but I have to. And I'm looking forward to the day when it won't be necessary. All right. The opposite is a rat hunt. What the French called in Algeria a ratinade. You go over into the Kasbah, you kill the rats, and you come back. You go over the wall, you hit them, and you come back. It's a matter of a short term, either out of the need to express an emotional release or to inflict some kind of short-term damage on a capability, but there's no analysis, no justification for the use of force that we have to do this so that the setting to make a political or diplomatic deal will be enhanced. That used to be the case. If you look at the way Israeli foreign policy and security policy was justified around the 67 war, or the 73 war, the war of attrition, even the first Intifada, the way it was fought, was we have to create the conditions which will enable political progress. When Israelis talk about striking Iran, when they talk about going into Gaza, when they talk about attacking Lebanon, when they did before the war, they didn't say, should we do it? What will it do to the prospects for a political process? They don't even say that anymore. They just ask, can we wipe out the capabilities this way or not? And for how long? That's all. The Vinograd report, the first version that came out, its main number one conclusion was what? There was no plan or purpose for this conflict. Nobody thought, what's the point? Well, exactly, that is the point that I'm trying to make. Without a point, you can't use force rationally, and that's one of the things we're seeing. It's both the pattern in the use of force and the absence of justifications and defenses of it that invoke the good it will do in the long term to bring a political process to fruition. Okay. The third logical implication of Habotz is to escape. And escape has many levels. As we know, there's a psychological escape, there's literal escape, there's a lot of ways to escape. I would argue that, so in my paper I discuss a whole panoply of ways that Israelis are leaving the Middle East. For one thing, they don't today have abandoned actually, I think it was Yossi Sarid, when he was education minister for a while, it was in a whole Arabic, you have to study Arabic. All Israeli students have to study Arabic. Well, the laws are still in the books, but they stopped it. Nobody's doing it. And they even virtually stopped all Arabic radio and television broadcasts of any serious sort coming out of Israel. There's just no interest in Arabic. There's no interest in Arabs, really. That's one way to escape. Another way is when there's a whole cottage industry in Israel now about branding. I don't mean branding, I mean, well, Israel's real problem is it's got to have it's a product. And it's got a bad brand name now. Everybody associates it with killing little kids, and we have to have a new brand. And I swear, you go out on Google and you just Google branding Israel, you'll find all these Israeli professors writing articles and books about branding. Because it doesn't matter, it's not branding Israel to the Middle Easterners. The Middle Easterners, they're not hoping to change what Middle Easterners see Israel as. It's what the West imagines Israel to be, that this branding campaign is directed to. The image that Barak started to make public, but which is popular, but which has been adopted more widely, what is Israel? It's a villa in the jungle. A villa in the jungle. That means a gated community. And now it's got a real gate, the wall. So, for the most part, people think about the wall as keeping Arabs, keeping the Middle East out of Israel. But I see it much more as keeping Israel out of the Middle East. So that Israelis can imagine that they are actually part of the European Western littoral, and not part of the Middle East at all. I was in Tel Aviv in the spring, and I was struck crossing the street to see across the street an advertisement for concerts that weekend. These are advertisements in Hebrew. Bob Dylan and others were appearing in Prague and Budapest. In other words, go to Europe for the weekend and go to a concert. That's the sense in which life, especially in Tel Aviv, but in Israel in general, people are encouraged to think of themselves as not living in the Middle East at all. Of course, there's a very specific way, a very physical sense of leaving, and that is emigration. I've been studying emigration from Israel since I started studying immigration into Israel of Jews and non-Jews in the late 90s. I published a piece in Middle East Journal on Israel as a non-Arab state, because really what Israel has wanted is not Jews so much as anybody who's not an Arab, and that has clouded the meaning of the country in an interesting way. But then I became interested in the emigration. Now, remember I said that Jewish population study of 2007. What's amusing about it is that people like Chaim Waxman, they're very serious, and others, Pergola, they're very serious demographers. They have a professional demographic reputation to defend. So they publish enormous amounts of statistics about birth rates and natural increase in different social economic classes and immigration from different countries. And then they end up having an extrapolation and data. And I noticed that the immigration numbers for 2007, they're using it to say what the population is. But it doesn't say net migration. It just says immigration. So I wrote to Chaim. He's a good friend of mine. I said, Chaim, this number of immigration, which I think it was like 19,000 or something, which is already very low. I said, is this the number of immigrants into the country, or is it the net number of Jewish immigrants? And the net number once you've subtracted the immigrants? Because I don't see a footnote about it, and I don't see any figure for emigration. So he quickly wrote me back, "Oh, you're absolutely right. Next time we've got to remember to include that immigration. You know, it's very hard to get those statistics." Well, yeah, it is, for good reason. The reason is that for the last 7 years or more, actually I think a little more than that, there's been a net Jewish emigration from Israel. And it's been significant. So, and they don't want to publicize this. But it's not just any old emigration. It's emigration of the elite. Because it's not everybody in Israel who can get a visa to come and live in the United States or Europe. It's those who have the means and those who had a grandparent who was a citizen of a European country before World War II. Now that if you can get a passport, a Polish passport, a Hungarian passport, you can live in France or Britain because it's the EU. So at least 100,000 Israelis have gotten European passports, justified as insurance policy, well, just in case, not planning to go anywhere, but just in case. And I was actually amused during the Lebanon War when Germany was standing by to evacuate Lebanese who were in danger from Beirut. The question was raised whether Jews, if Israel was in danger, would Germany evacuate Jewish Israelis who were German citizens? Yes, the answer is yes, Germany would evacuate them. There was a poll, there have always been polls in Israel about how many people say they want to leave the country. This is a common poll. But recently there was a general who writes for a right-wing think tank. He wrote a piece called Resilience, how resilient the Israeli people are. He was writing it during the Al-Aqsa Intifada, or just afterwards, saying, people think that the Al-Aqsa Intifada had a terrible impact on our morale, but you know something? Look at the way that the Israeli population withstood this pressure. It's really very resilient. One of the pieces of evidence he advanced was a poll that he did, in which he asked people, well, what he said was, I'm going to prove it to you, 69% of people questioned said they wanted to stay in the country. This is remarkable that you would ask people, do you want to stay in the country? I'm struck, for 31% say presumably no, they didn't want to stay in the country, but the idea that you would ask, can you imagine somebody calling you up and saying, this is a poll, would you like to stay here in the United States? You just don't ask that question. You certainly don't ask it. If you do ask it, you're cutting the legs out of the argument that the public is actually not thinking of leaving. There are some other indications that this is a very serious question. First of all, aside from the passports, the failure to attract Jewish immigrants and keep them once they come has turned people into talking about a different kind of aliyah, which is part-time commuters. So dentists come from New Jersey. They keep their practice in New Jersey. They live for 3 months, 4 months a year in Jerusalem. Okay. In fact, I have a quote from one of Israel's leading economic commentators that I thought you might find amusing, Shlomo Maital from the Technion, and came up with a theory justifying this idea of partial. Says. He noted that 40,000 Israelis now live and work in Silicon Valley in California. And he suggested that the large-scale immigration of highly skilled Israelis should be reconceptualized. Leaving Israel, wrote Shlomo Maital, should not be seen as a betrayal of Zionism, since in a globalizing age, quote, where on this planet you live matters less than how you think and act toward Israel, which opens all kinds of opportunities for Palestinians. Because it doesn't matter where they live, actually, if they have the right kind of thinking about Israel. But that also suggests that, it's possible to emigrate part-time, which is what's happening. Israelis can take a job in an American university, be here half their lives, but not have left, and still be counted in the census as if they're there, even while they're being counted as a census as being here. This part-time, so there's a whole industry of part-time immigration. In fact, Chaim Waxman has written about this sociologically. but they never talk about the other side of it as part-time emigration, partial emigration, where people are setting up other homes, other centers of life for them, and especially for their children. Now, I believe that one of the reasons, if not the main reason, for the paranoia in Israel, the hysteria about the Iranian bomb, the Iranian nuclear weapon, is not because anyone really thinks that they're going to use a nuclear weapon on Israel. I haven't found any serious security person or political person in Israel who thinks that. So what are they so upset about? They're upset about the fact that with the image of having a nuclear capacity, and in an Israel that is fundamentally, at its core, traumatized by the Holocaust, and a Jewish people that is still reeling from the Holocaust, that an elite that has the idea that that could happen again in Israel, and that the Muslim fundamentalists have the capacity to destroy the Jews in Israel, will not keep their children in the country. So it's that fear of the psychological impact of living in a world where the Holocaust mentality turns on the Israeli population. And this came out brilliantly, if somewhat, in Burg's book, Avram Burg. He wrote a book which has been caricatured in the press. It's not been translated into English. I'm reading it in Hebrew. It is an unbelievable book. And weirdly, the day I arrived in Israel to give this talk is the day the book was released, in which, most sensationally of all, he announces that any Israeli able to get a European passport should get one. Now, there's most of the book is about the Holocaust and the deep effect it has had on Israel, but it leads to that conclusion in a certain way. But I don't have time to go into that. We can talk about it a little bit. Okay, I'm coming to a conclusion. I hope I've shown you that when you start with the image of Abotz HaMizrach HaTichoni, it can organize a tremendous amount about what's going on in Israel, much more than I've had time to tell you. But I now want to come to the overall conclusion, because once Israel has abandoned the Iron Wall as a theory and as a strategy for dealing with the problem that it deep down knew it confronted in the late 19th and early 20th century, it can't avoid re-confronting that stark problem. And what is that stark problem? It's the problem of a fragment society that did not annihilate the Aboriginal population. A fragment society is an old term we know of from Louis Hartz about a piece of Europe that kind of spun off and landed in the Third World or in the New World. And essentially, we are a fragment society. Most of Latin America is, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, pieces of Europe. We completely overwhelmed, decimated, annihilated, rendered politically irrelevant the Native American population. That was done in New Zealand, it was done in Australia, it was done in Canada. And the result was success for those. Nobody questions whether the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia should be there. Now we're strong enough to be able to say, well, it's really terrible what we did, and we're going to try to rehabilitate the native cultures as long as they stay on the reservation or within certain limits. But politically, it's not an issue. If you look at those fragment societies that, for historical or moral or some other reasons, did not, or demographic, did not annihilate or render irrelevant their Aboriginal populations, it's a small list. The Crusaders, South Africa, French Algeria, Rhodesia. I would also include, by the way, Bosnia, from the Muslim point of view, a fragment of Islam in Europe. And Israel.
And Ireland.
Well, Ulster, but yes, and the Ulster part of Ireland, which is still in process. What does that list have in common? It's not a good group to be in. because none of them exist anymore, except for Israel. They kind of last between about 60 and 120 years. And I've been interested in how you can see cultural changes in them that point to the appearance of the horizon, the political horizon, new meaning of that phrase, the political horizon.
Thanks to Condoleezza.
Yeah, I hear it in a different way than she does. And with the Iron Wall was a brilliant attempt to overcome the logic of historical sociology that really doesn't allow for something like that to last all that long. Without it, Israel is back up against this fundamental incompatibility. That is, if the same reaction is taking place on the other side of the wall, which I actually think it is. For example, just to give you an example, that just as you don't find in the Israeli press criticism of Israeli military policies because they're undercutting the possibility of productive political negotiations in a future which we would really like to have, so you also do not see very commonly, and if you do, please tell me where, in the Arab press, criticisms of Israeli policies because they are undermining the possibility of peace in the future. The Islamist hegemony is helping make such arguments irrelevant, even if they occurred to people. Now, the last one I want to make is that it's not just, and this is the part that was not in the paper that you read, and it's not just in the perspective of comparative historical sociology that Israel is up against a dreadful problem now that it's abandoned the Iron Wall strategy and theory. It also confronts it with a pattern in Jewish history, which Zionism managed to obscure. Zionism tells the story of the return of the Jews as if there was the leaving of the Jews, and now there's the return. But the fact is that Jews return to the land many, 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 many times. In fact, there's only one thing as common as Jews returning to the land: leaving the land. That's why they had to return so many times. Abraham came, he left, he came back. Isaac came, he left, he came back. Jacob came, he left, he came back. The Israelites came, were there, they went to Babylonia, they came back. It's over and over and over again. And it's not always with a bang. Sometimes it's with a whimper. Many more Jews were living outside the land of Israel than inside the land of Israel before the Roman expulsion. Now, you can summarize this question of a bang or a whimper. And by the way, I don't want to end this on a totally bleak note.
Please.
I think that I do not rule out, I treat everything I've said as one large hypothesis. Okay? I'm not arguing that I've done enough research on this to be as sure as I was, in the books that I've published that are in the past. This is something I'm working on now. This is my hypothesis. But part of the hypothesis is that if the United States did what its official policy says it should do and what it's capable of, there still may be a chance for a negotiated solution based on two states. I don't believe that the problem is the settlements or that the Palestinians wouldn't accept something. I think the Palestinians will accept certain things that Israel, in theory, could be brought to give. My fear is that it no longer matters. That the Arab world, the Muslim world, the non-Jewish Middle Eastern world hates Israel more than they love the Palestinians. Has no longer an interest in or no longer a belief that the Jewish state can be digested, can be lived with. That's the other side that I haven't talked to you about that I need to investigate for this argument to have the weight that I think it may deserve. So that non-bleak comment was to preface the final sentence, which is that Israel faces two images in its future that are from its Jewish historical past: the image of Samson and the image of Jeremiah. The image of Samson is, let me die with mine enemies. The Samson complex. If we're going to die, everybody's going to die with us. Jeremiah was the prophet that told the Jews that they would have to abandon the land. They would have to leave. The forces were too great. History and God was no longer with them. He went into exile with them. That image of Jeremiah has never received any attention for obvious reasons in Israel. But I see the future, if they don't strike a deal soon, as a choice between Samson and Jeremiah.